The book that we're going to be reading from this week is titled Farm Workers Unite, and it's about how two Mexican-American leaders, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, helped migrant farm workers in California and other states improve their living and working conditions. Think about this question. What do you think you know about how produce, meaning fruits and vegetables, is grown in the United States? This image shows California's Central Valley, and since the early 1900s, produce growers in California have hired mostly temporary workers to do the planting and harvesting on their farms. This Central Valley region of California is where more than half of the country's fruits and vegetables come from. The migrant workers, many of whom are Mexican Americans, they move from farm to farm looking for work, and up until the late 1960s, most migrant workers lived and worked in very awful conditions. And to this day, some still do. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta helped farm workers stand up for themselves and their rights. And in what's called the Great Grape Boycott of 1967, Chavez and Huerta helped organize where people all over the United States learned about the lives of farm workers. This is the table of contents, and you can see this on page 67 in your student response book. Take a glance at the table of contents and think about what topics you'll learn about or read about in this book. State of California. The Central Valley and Salinas Valley of California have ideal growing conditions for hundreds of kinds of fruits and vegetables. Most of the produce eaten in America is grown in these two valleys. Introduction. California is home to the fertile Great Central Valley, a long, flat valley in the middle of the state. More than 350 kinds of fruit and vegetables grow there, and more than half the fresh produce that Americans eat comes from there. For centuries, the Great Central Valley was divided into small farms. However, by the 1950s, most of the farmland was owned by just a few wealthy farmers. They had slowly bought land from small farmers struggling to make a living. The new farms covered thousands of acres. Grapes, strawberries, lettuce, and broccoli stretched as far as anyone could see. To plant and harvest the crops on these huge farms, the growers needed workers. Because they needed the workers only during the planting and harvesting seasons, they didn't hire permanent staff. Instead, they hired workers who moved from one place to another looking for work, or migrant workers. Today, millions of workers a year move around the United States, mostly in California, to plant and harvest fruit and vegetables. The work migrant workers do in the fields is hard, but thanks to Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, two Mexican Americans who fought for the rights of farm workers in the southwestern United States during the 1960s and 70s, conditions for the workers are much better than they used to be. This is the story of Chavez, Huerta, and the United Farm Workers of America. Migrant workers. After the American Civil War ended in 1865, many migrant workers began coming to the United States. They came from countries such as Mexico, China, and the Philippines because they couldn't find work in their own countries. These people were poor and desperate for work. They believed, in the United States, that they could earn enough money to feed their families and that their children could go to school. Since 1945, much of the farm work in the United States has been done by Mexican Americans whose families have lived in the United States for several generations. It is also done by Mexicans who come across the border just for the harvest season. Some come illegally. Others have papers that allow them to work legally. Mexican Americans are often joined on the farms by African Americans, Puerto Ricans, Filipinos, and other workers from Central and South America. You can pause the video and just think for a moment. What did you find out about migrant workers? This is Chapter 1. If you look at the photo on the left, the caption says, Mexican migrant workers pick strawberries in the Salinas Valley, California, in 1963. Chapter 1, Competition for Work. When there are not enough jobs for everyone who wants them, workers have to compete for jobs. Beginning in the 1940s, migrant farm workers in the United States faced growing competition for jobs. More migrant workers came into the United States because of the Bracero program, which was set up by the government in 1942. Because so many men were overseas fighting in World War II, the government allowed growers to bring in extra workers, called braceros, from Mexico to plant and harvest crops. After the war ended in 1945, farm owners kept hiring braceros instead of other workers because the braceros were willing to work longer hours for less pay. The farmers wanted to spend less money paying workers so they could keep the cost of food lower and make a bigger profit. More workers also came into the United States by crossing the border illegally. Farmers hired illegal workers for the same reason they hired braceros, because they were willing to work for much lower wages than local workers. The illegal workers didn't complain because their pay was still higher than it would have been in their home countries, and they feared deportation if they spoke out. At the same time the number of workers was rising, jobs were disappearing. After World War II, new machines were invented to plant and harvest crops. The machines did a lot of the work that had been done before by migrant workers. More and more farmers used machinery on their farms during the 1950s and 60s. As a result, there were fewer jobs for the growing number of workers. That's the end of chapter 1. Think about this question. What are some reasons it became harder for farm workers to find jobs? Chapter 2, The Life of a Migrant Worker. Working conditions. Because there were more workers than jobs, migrant workers were easy to replace. Those who did find work knew that there were always other workers waiting to fill their jobs. Therefore, many migrant workers were willing to work in bad conditions without complaining because it was better than having no job at all. On many farms, men, women, and children were exploited. They worked in the fields from dawn until late at night. There were no bathrooms in the fields, and sometimes workers weren't allowed to take breaks, even to drink water. Workers were often in the searing heat of the direct sun, and midday temperatures in the summer could reach over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Migrant workers used tools that were both damaging and dangerous. The short-handled hoe, a digging tool used to thin out crops, had a handle that was only 1 to 2 feet long. Workers who used it had to spend 10 to 12 hours a day in a bent-over position. At the end of a shift, they were unable to stand up straight. Many workers who spent years using the short-handled hoe became permanently stooped and suffered from lifelong back pain. Another tool, the beet hook, which had a razor-sharp blade with a hook attached to the end of it, was used for harvesting beets. Workers used it to pick up beets from the ground and slice the tops off in one swing. Many beet workers lost fingers using this tool. Field work was also dangerous because of the pesticides or poisons used to kill insects on crops. Sometimes workers handled pesticides themselves, and other times pesticides were sprayed from planes directly onto the crops and onto the workers at the same time. Exposure to pesticides could cause headaches, dizziness, and nausea. Living conditions. Because one of the ways growers made a profit on their crops was to pay migrant workers very low wages, it was difficult for the workers to make enough money to live on. Sometimes every member of a family had to work in order for the family to survive. Children as young as 4 or 5 worked in the fields helping their parents. And before I go on, I just want to focus on the 2 photos here. This top one is, the caption says, "The short-handed hoe, or el cortito, was a tool that was especially hated by farm workers. It was finally banned in 1973. You can see how much they have to bend over." And the second photo, the caption says, "A worker sprays pesticides on grapevines." Back to the living conditions section. Because they had so little money, Migrant workers often could not afford their own housing. Instead, they lived in sometimes terrible conditions in housing provided on the farms where they worked. For example, up to 4 families might live in a one-room shack with no running water or electricity. Some of the farmers who housed workers on their land subtracted rent money from the workers' wages or made workers pay for transportation to and from the fields. As a result, the workers had little money left over, so it was difficult for them to save enough money to live elsewhere. In some farm housing, there were no bathing facilities or safe drinking water. Disease was common and would spread quickly in the overcrowded housing. When workers were sick, they often did not get good medical care because they were afraid of losing their jobs if they took time off to seek medical attention. Also, workers who wanted care often didn't have transportation to the doctor's office or hospital, or, because they didn't speak English, a way to communicate with healthcare workers. And if you look at the photo, the caption says, "A Migrant Worker's Home in California in 1937. Education. Because children of migrant workers often worked in the fields alongside their families, many of them did not go to school. Those who did go to school changed schools as often as every few weeks, as their families moved from place to place in search of work. It was hard for them to understand their teachers or participate in their classes because they often spoke little or no English. If they spoke their native languages in school, they risked being bullied by other children or punished by their teachers. Because children who went to school often worked in the fields before and after school, they had little time or energy to study. Therefore, many migrant children didn't do well in school. Not surprisingly, many stopped going to school at a young age and went to work in the fields full time. And the photo above, the caption says, "Most children worked in the fields with their parents each day before and after school." Here are some questions to think about after Chapter 2. What did you find out about what it was like to work in the fields? What did you find out about how migrant workers lived from this reading? And what made going to school difficult for the children of migrant workers?